First of all, thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you, Christina. And thanks to the Library Archives Canada and National Archives of Ireland for putting on this symposium, which gives us a great opportunity to try out new ideas, to exchange ideas with one another, and to discuss these ideas with yourselves. It's a wonderful opportunity. It took place 2 years ago. I found it an enormously stimulating event then, and I have no doubt it will be the same now. The subject of my talk this morning is state security, civil liberty, and the Fenian underground in Canada. And I'd like, first of all, can you hear me all right? Yep, all right. I'd like to begin with the historian A.T.Q. Stewart, who once remarked that each historian should have two signs on his or her desk, one reading, "I do not know," and the other reading, "Everything is older than we think." I do not know. There is much that remains to be discovered about Fenian activities in Canada during the 1860s. And there's been virtually no research on such matters as the suspension of habeas corpus in response to those activities. Everything is older than we think. 2 weeks ago, in his inquiry about Canadian complicity in the detention and torture of 3 Canadians in Egypt and Syria, Judge Frank Iacobucci wrote that the key question involved the appropriate response of our democracy in Canada to the pernicious phenomenon of terrorism, and ensuring that, in protecting the security of our country, we respect the human rights and freedoms that so many have fought to achieve. The same point was made in 2006 by Judge Dennis O'Connor during his investigation of the Mayor Arar affair. Now, before going any further, I want to make the obvious point that the Fenians were not a 19th century version of Al-Qaeda and never entertained anything remotely comparable to the mass killing of innocent civilians. The extent to which the Fenian Brotherhood can be described as a terrorist organization is highly debatable. For John O'Neill, the Fenian hero of Ridgeway, terrorist methods such as assassinations were completely unacceptable. Open warfare with the forces of the Crown was the honourable course of action. But for other prominent Fenians, such as Tom Kelly and John McCafferty, assassinations were a perfectly legitimate and justifiable mode of operation. And as the research of Barry Kennerk and Patrick Maughan has shown, there was a Fenian shooting circle of some 30 members in Dublin with assassination as their primary objective. Now, much, of course, hinges on the definition of terrorism. If the word is taken to mean actual or threatened violence directed for political ends against informers, politicians, judges, policemen. If it includes plans to attack banks and parliamentary buildings, including the parliamentary buildings here, to destroy railway and telegraph communications, if it corresponds to John Mitchell's statement that the, quote, Irish people, unquote, had the right to attack Britain in any way, at any place, at any time, then, yes, there was a terrorist element within Fenianism. Certainly, the British and Canadian governments thought so, and used the word at the time, the system of terror. I also want to make it clear that the Canadian state during the 1860s was not involved in such euphemistically named activities as rendition. I mean, where would you send suspected Fenians? And there's no evidence that Fenian prisoners were tortured in Canadian jails, although this could fall into the I do not know category. On the other hand, there's little doubt that the police manufactured evidence against Patrick James Whelan, the man who was accused of assassinating Thomas D'Arcy McGee, and who was, in fact, probably guilty. Just as there is little doubt that the Fenian prisoners in Kingston Penitentiary were given an exceedingly rough time. Having said all this, it still seems to me that there are interesting parallels between the situation of ethnic minorities in contemporary Canada and the situation facing Irish Catholics in Protestant English-speaking Canada during the 1860s. Consider, for example, the debate over crime reporting in mid-19th century Canada. In response to newspaper reports that specified the religion and nationality of convicted criminals, Irish Catholic leaders countered that criminals should be classified by their crimes and not by their origins. The same argument has been made by contemporary ethnic community leaders against collecting crime statistics by race. Or consider Irish Catholic demands in the mid-19th century for political, religious, and social parity with the population at large. Some of them even wanted parity of place names. There weren't enough Irish place names in Canada, therefore, well, the Irish were a quarter of the population, a quarter of the place names should be Irish. This has a certain contemporary resonance as well. Or consider the debate over separate schools during the 1860s. The arguments for and against the Scott Bill of 1861 resurfaced in the last provincial election in Ontario, when John Tory promised to extend public funding to faith-based schools. Similar arguments, including the thin end of the wedge objection and the argument that educational fragmentation would undermine a shared sense of Canadian identity. As an aside, I must admit that although I would prefer to see people educated together rather than educated apart, the fears of those who opposed separate schools in 1861 have not been borne out, at least not yet. But perhaps the most intriguing parallel of all consists in the condition of an ethno-religious minority that contained a revolutionary component with international links. An ethno-religious minority that contained a revolutionary component with international links. For all the differences between 19th century Irish Canadian Catholics and the multiple ethnic groups of 21st century Canadian Muslims, for all the differences between Fenian revolutionaries and groups such as the Toronto 18, now down to 10, I believe, the dilemma facing the Canadian state during the 1860s had much in common with the dilemma facing the Canadian state today. Canada and British America, D'Arcy McGee in 1866. Canada and British America have never known an enemy so subtle, so irrational, so hard to trace, and therefore so difficult to combat. Hence the problem, then as now. How could you defeat a revolutionary minority inside an ethno-religious group without alienating the moderate majority within that group? How could you balance the requirements of state security with the demands of civil liberty? Well, let's see how they did it back then. Thomas D'Arcy McGee. He was a kind of Conor Cruise O'Brien figure, someone who'd rejected his earlier Irish nationalism, who wanted to cut through Irish Catholic ambivalence about revolutionary nationalism, who wanted to isolate and marginalize revolutionary Irish Canadian nationalists through a confrontational strategy of polarization. It's a fascinating story, and one that I could pursue at length this morning, But I've been working on it for several years now, and I could use a break. So suffice it to say that both Darcy McGee and Cruz O'Brien displayed remarkable moral courage in attacking atavistic nationalism, but that their strategy alienated many moderate nationalists and may well have had more impact outside rather than inside their respective communities.